Great to be on this call. I'm sorry I've missed them. Things didn't work out throughout the fall, but I'm happy to be joining this group in the conversation. Just a couple of background notes to who I am. I'm a minister at St. Paul's in Orillia, and I've been here for 5 years, helping this congregation to transform itself into a center with lots of concerts and an indigenous gallery and connections and education programs, music schools, and those kinds of things that all of us are interested in. Further background, for 15 years I was the executive director of Faith in the Common Good, and so it was through that work that the ideas of the commons emerged, and as we looked at finding interfaith connections around seeking the common good. And as I got into the literature about the commons in the last, 4 or 5 years, looking a little more deeply into it, I think it's a paradigm or a metaphor, a way of helping us to imagine how the United Church or faith communities can be in the 21st century. And so I'm going to quickly go through a PowerPoint presentation to try to capture this idea for you, very hopefully succinctly, and we can then get into conversation and see whether it's a helpful image or metaphor to help us as religious leaders in our thinking. So I'll do the share thing here and put this up, and so that's present to you guys. People can see that. Okay. So first of all, commons language is, when you do one of these word associations, it comes up a lot, and we use it in all kinds of ways. And there's lots of misunderstanding, I think, about the idea of the commons and how it's interpreted in society. And one of the biggest misconceptions about it is the tragedy of the commons idea. If you've studied any economics, which I haven't, but associated with people that do, they teach still the tragedy of the commons, which is a notion that was developed in the 60s that based on a kind of a perception of human nature as being inherently greedy, and that if people were on the common land, I would try and put more cows on it than you would, and that the nature of kind of capitalist thinking is that we would quickly destroy it because of our own kind of greedy instincts. That this is more like a free-for-all and doesn't adequately describe what a commons is. A commons has boundaries, has responsibilities, has checks and balances, and that historically. So the tragedy is that it was misrepresented, and economics schools still conceive of it in this misconceived way. Pauline was saying yesterday that shopping malls around her are described as commons, and it's not what we're implying in this kind of conversation. So there's lots of other ideas than what we're trying to draw here. One of the first people that drew me into understanding the commons was Heather Menzies, who's written lots about economic justice things, member of First United in Ottawa. And I really like this, her drawing on the legacy of the commons. I invite people to come home to themselves, come home to community as habitat, and to the earth as a larger habitat in which all life is nested. So kind of these three things about understanding ourselves in relation to the commons idea, community as habitat, and the earth as this larger habitat. And her book is excellent in terms of helping to give both a history and a critique of how we have to move beyond capitalism. One of the interesting pieces was Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for her work on the commons. She looked at it from a land-based perspective and around the world, and discovered that commons have these principles that guide the decision-making with kind of escalating responsibilities and boundaries and so on. So won't go into it, but it's just, this is a serious economic approach, and there's lots of serious academic work around it. This book I was just reading over Christmas, and David Bollier and Silke Hendrick are both longtime researchers and advocates around the commons. And this book is really excellent, and if you want to delve more deeply into it. And the interesting thing to me is, having read a number of Bollier's books, he focuses, has in the past, around the political economy dimensions of the commons and how it gets applied in society and can reorganize lots of economic and political structures. The interesting thing in this book, and maybe it's Silke's influence, is understanding it as an ontological shift, that it's not just about the land-based approach or housing or those things, but it's a whole shift in consciousness that's needed. And that's, I think, as a religious community, this is something that we can pay attention to. So I'll just highlight a bit of this, what they're calling an onto shift, that ontology being the window through which we see the world, our basic assumptions. And I'm excited these days reading George Lakoff and George Marshall and Jeremy Lent about understanding around language and metaphor as shaping our consciousness, that we all live within stories and frames describe how we communicate things. So I assume or hope you're excited about this understanding how important language is in determining us as individuals and determining the who we are in communities and how that shapes us. To me, it's a huge reimagining of how we look at religion and a whole bunch of things. And so it needs a whole lots of explanation as we kind of work on this onto shift. Because the Western ontology, as we know, and we work within this, is shaped from a philosophical standpoint from Plato, Bacon, Descartes, Hobbes, Locke, that whole intellectual tradition that focuses towards dualism and towards the individual. And so in our Western thinking, we have that few thousand-year history of taking us there. In the last 400 or 500 years, we've come to presume the state and market as the containers in which we live and work. So that whole framework where we practice religion and live and have our sense of identity is in this Western ontology and shapes our economics, law, politics, and religious thinking. So trying to unpack these days what dualism, how to move beyond dualism in our head, heart things, and using complex science and all these good things that are challenging our basic assumptions about our Western ontology. So what is being raised up is a relational ontology of commons, that we, rather than starting from an individual perspective, it's based on a deep relationality of everything. And these authors use the word nested I rather than the I, we kinds of imagining that we have a nested I concept of us, each of us invested in the language, metaphor, frames, and that we live within that. And then remember from our theology days, the Ubuntu rationality. I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am. All that kind of good twist around in terms of imagining that we are a collective, interconnected, and that we need to begin to see ourselves in this interconnected way. So relations between entities is more important than the entities themselves. And all the good stuff we're getting from quantum theology and complexity sciences and complexity systems theory and how that's changing our theological worldviews and understanding of who we are. So playing with George Lakoff talks about we need to change the metaphors if we're going to change our consciousness, change our way of looking at things. So playing with the idea of the eco-commons as being a different metaphor that begins to imagine ourselves in this kind of collective interrelated dimension with both the earth and each other, and to shift us. Eco being household, the root of ecology, economics, ecumenical, calm and unis together as one. So eco, household together as one. And for me, the commons are defined by being local, cooperative, equitable, and sustainable. That we imagine commons as being unique entities unto themselves, people doing self-governance, working how to work together, how to build trust, but that it can be part of what Jeremy Rifkin calls glocal, which is a new word to me. Just reading Jeremy Rifkin's Green New Deal, and he uses the word glocal, which is that global local idea. So I love this idea of kind of in a complex relationship. If the 20th century was all about centralizing, I think this century is about decentralizing and having hubs or commons or however we describe it, but that each of us can be doing different things, building relationship locally, but that we can share values and appreciation and share difference and all the kind of things that good United Church ethics is all about. So I'll just quickly give some examples of commons around the world that represent commoning efforts. There's lots going on. When you begin to pay attention to it, it's quite amazing how many efforts and things, particularly in Europe and other parts of the world, lots of commoning efforts as people learn to cooperate and live in this new commons way. This is the Zaatari refugee camp, which has between 80 and 100,000 people in Jordan. So this is their Champs-Élysées Main Street, where all kinds of commons businesses emerging there in the desert, where they've had to build a whole society, a city of 80 to 100,000 people, and doing it in a new kind of cooperative way. This Giffynet is a open, free, neutral web platform, or not more than web platform, a whole network that allows people to use it in an open source kind of way, the Creative Commons idea. Wikihouse is open architecture. People, architects using it as an open platform to help people build affordable housing and meet housing needs all over the world. And so it uses design tools and so on. This, I don't know how to, Bertzog, how to do the Dutch pronunciation, but This is a very cool organization, 10,000 nurses. It's transformed healthcare in the Netherlands and now in different parts of the world, where nurses work in independently in a kind of meeting the needs of people rather than kind of the delivery service that we have here of healthcare needs. The nurses or practitioners help individuals to set their own kind of what their needs are, and they facilitate it. So it's both saving a bunch of money, but imagining healthcare in a much more interrelated and helpful way. So everything from the House of Commons language, here's a few examples. I think this is in Newmarket, Creative Commons, Commons. So these are some of the land-based things. This is a housing complex out in Vancouver that understands itself as a commons and works on the relationship. The Hamilton Commons is a church, people attempting to be church in a different way. Same with this community, working together to creatively live out. Humber College, Learning Commons, Forestry Commons, Garden and Market Commons. So I give you those examples just as examples of how people all over the place are attempting to move to a different kind of relational understanding of an economic and social and political way of being that I think takes us beyond our current capitalist market state dynamics into a new cooperative understanding of how we get together. So it's this nested I and Ubuntu rationality, entangled identities, local, cooperative, democratic, sustainable, global. So these are kind of the values and the deep work that it takes to move in that direction. So the question then is, these things are happening all around us. Where are we as church people, and how do we understand ourselves in relationship to this movement that's around us? For me, as both as an academic but as a practitioner, the social gospel was the way I understood the core of the United Church and the work that we did in the 20th century to help facilitate the welfare state in Canada. I think we were instrumental in this. I wrote my doctoral thesis on the impacts of the United Church in helping to shape the kind of culture we have in Canada. The question for me is, in this time of uncertainties about church and who we are and all these things, is the idea of an eco-commons a way, or the whole commoning effort, a way to transform our work in the 21st century to embodying a different way of being community, working together, helping to transform our local, global realities. So it's a challenge, and it's what I'm attempting to do here. So one of the things that's been interesting as I played with it and work with it here in this congregation is to begin to imagine what we typically understand ourselves as doing as church leaders, and seeing a correlation into eco-commons as similar but profoundly different in many ways. So worship, all humans need celebration and ceremonies, ritual. And so how do we help facilitate that core understanding of celebration and life and the kind of ritualistic core of who we are as humans? So can we transition from kind of our Christocentric kinds of understandings into a more earth-centric, pan-entheistic, so on and so on, like whole conversation around what ritual means. Pastoral care, similar but different, moving from doing it for others to how do we understand care for each other as we work age in that process of exploring and learning skills and all those good things, rather than delivering education about this or that. Outreach, the shift from, again, delivering outreach to being part of community development, doing social enterprise, working in gardens and community and all the kinds of different ways we engage, but in the commons is the vehicle in which we work together. Hospitality and welcoming, we want to be a welcoming church, but can we shift the rhetoric to a sharing of resources and understanding what hospitality means in a commons kind of perspective? I know, I'm sorry that it's throwing a lot at you. Anyway, just the distinctions as I play with what the kingdom looks like. We come out of our Christendom understandings, and for me, playing with an idea of common as in representing our human understanding, and good representing divine energy. Like, how do we represent a different cosmology of divine relationship and the planetary realities in which we live? So my challenge, and love to be in conversation with you, is, can we imagine the United Church or faith communities embracing a different rhetoric, a different ontology, different piece of work? Is that an objective in this decade? For me, I've said it as to work on this in the next 5 years. Other congregations we've been in conversation with is doing that. So how invested are we in preserving the church as it is, or can we begin to use different metaphors like the eco-commons to take us to a different place in this time and era? So there's a big dump. So how do I stop sharing or something? Pause.